Hi there. In some of my previous videos you may have heard me refer to peer review. But what exactly is peer review? And more importantly, does being peer reviewed mean that a source is definitely reliable? Stay tuned to find out. It's probably a good idea to start this video off by identifying the context in which peer review exists. Of course, we want academic sources to be factually accurate, honest and reliable. And ideally, we'd like some way of determining whether this is the case for any potential contribution to the academic literature before it gets published. There are lots of things that could make a source unreliable, including dishonesty, bias, factual inaccuracy, a lack of methodological rigour, inappropriate or misleading use of statistics, and so on. Ideally, we want a way of establishing if a contribution to the academic literature is suffering from any of the above flaws before it makes it into publication. A quality control process, if you will. Of course, we can't simply ask the authors of a source whether their contribution is sound, because this would assume that they're aware of any problems with their contribution and that they would admit to any such problems, knowing that this would undermine their chances of getting their work published. So just as the legal system has a fundamental principle that no one can be a judge in their own case, academia has its own version of this principle that says that authors do not get to decide whether their work merits publication. Peer review is considered the gold standard by which this principle is achieved. So how does peer review work? Well, there are differences in the way that peer review is implemented, but a typical process goes something like this. An author is interested in having their work published in a particular publication, let's say a particular journal. So they submit a manuscript of their work to the editor of that journal. The editor then briefly reviews their work with the aim of determining whether they would be provisionally interested in publishing the work and thus whether it should be sent off for peer review. If the editor deems the manuscript to be of provisional interest to their publication, then they'll typically forward that manuscript, usually with the author's details removed, i.e. anonymously, to a series of academics who are regarded as experts in the topic that that paper addresses. These academics will be asked to review the paper with respect to particular criteria, which might include things like the appropriateness of the sources that are being used, the methodological rigour of the work, the appropriateness of any statistical analysis being employed, and so on. Each reviewer will be asked to make a decision about whether that work should be published. Each reviewer will be asked to give a written account of the reasons for their decision, which can range from outright rejection with no resubmission invited to an outright acceptance with no modifications to the text required. Once each reviewer has conveyed their decision back to the editor of the publication, it is the editor that has the final say on whether the work will be published in that particular publication, and they will convey their decision to the author of the manuscript in writing. The correspondence from the editor to the author will generally outline the comments and ratings given to the manuscript by each of the peer reviewers, and it will convey the final decision that's made about whether the paper should be published from the editor themselves. If that final decision is that the paper should be revised and resubmitted, the editor will invite the author to make a series of revisions to the paper that they will generally stipulate, and then resubmit that paper with a covering letter that outlines the changes the author has made to their submission in the light of the peer review process. If the changes made by the author to the manuscript are considered acceptable following peer review, then the editor will generally agree to publish the work. If the changes made by the author are considered unacceptable, then the editor may request further amendments or simply refuse to publish the work. In theory, having work reviewed by experts in the applicable subject area as a prerequisite to getting published should help maintain the quality of academic literature. In practice, it's not quite that simple. So, is peer review reliable? Well, according to the literature, not especially. At the very least, we would have to concede that the evidence for the effectiveness of peer review hardly justifies its ubiquity within academia, and that our understanding of the peer review process is far from complete. The problem, of course, is that the reliability of peer review very much depends on the way that the process is implemented and the quality of the individual reviews, and these things can vary considerably. The same, or at least very similar issues that can undermine a manuscript, for example factual inaccuracy or bias, can also undermine the peer review process. For example, it's possible that one or more members of a peer review team may lack sufficient expertise to notice a big problem or significant omission with the work being reviewed. Even appropriately qualified peer reviewers can have an off day. Perhaps they are too busy with other commitments to give a paper the attention that it really needs. Some reviewers may even be biased against a manuscript, perhaps because the author of that manuscript takes a very different perspective than they would have taken, or perhaps because they have a similar piece of work in the pipeline and don't want the author beating them to the punch. The upshot of the issues with the peer review process is that sometimes papers that would make a perfectly valid contribution to a particular field get rejected. In contrast, sometimes papers that contain seemingly glaringly obvious errors or omissions get accepted for publication following peer review. From a practical point of view, just because a paper has been accepted following peer review does not mean that it is devoid of serious errors or omissions. At this point, you might wonder if there's been any research on ways of improving the peer review process. And indeed, such research has occurred, albeit in a limited fashion and mainly within the biomedical field. But unfortunately, things like training peer reviewers, providing checklists for peer reviewers when they're compiling their reports on a particular manuscript, and blinding peer reviewers to the identity of authors have failed to significantly improve the peer review process. In some sections of academic publishing, there has been a move towards open peer review, common features of which are that the identity of the peer reviewers is revealed and that their reports are published and available for scrutiny. There is some evidence that this process improves the quality of peer reviewers' reports. So where does all this leave you as a student? Well, peer review is often likened to democracy, i.e. a flawed system but the best one possible. I would wholeheartedly agree with this analogy, but take it one step further. Like democracy, you should engage with peer review enthusiastically, but always be mindful of its limitations. You should prioritise peer-reviewed literature in your literature search, but you should never regard a paper having got past peer review as a cast-iron guarantee that it is without serious flaws or omissions. You should also avoid the allure of the appeal to authority when it comes to peer review. By this, I mean you should avoid making the assumption that the more prestigious a publication is, the more reliable its peer review process will be, because there really isn't any evidence to support this assumption. The most important take-home message for you as a student is that the onus is always on you to critically evaluate your sources. You can't rely on the peer review process to do this for you and simply switch off your critical faculties. If you're new to the process of critical evaluation, I'll put a link to a video in the top right hand corner of the screen that should help get you started. I hope you found this video helpful. If so, please do hit the like button. If you hadn't already, why not subscribe to my channel for more videos on how psychology can help you study more effectively. If you want to know when I post new content, simply turn on the bell notification. Thanks very much.